Thank you for allowing me the opportunity. I am 10 months in, so I think it's my first time to be here. And that's not because I only wanted to come the day in which Jim had graciously invited me to speak, but just getting my feet underneath me. And as you know, a situation of ministry that can be super challenging. What Jim didn't tell you, I need to say from the outset here. So let me just go ahead and tell you how today is different than most days when you show up for these. You see, Jim normally goes and he asks people to come and to speak at these leadership luncheons because they either have education, experience, expertise, like they are the guru about what they're talking about. But that's not today, okay? Jim asked me to do this, and we're talking about being faithful for the long haul. And friends, I just want you to know that probably today I'm talking to me in the room more than I'm talking to you. Because you see, you know that I don't have to tell you what oftentimes these moments become. Ministry is hard. And you hear the guy say, yes, ministry is hard. Life is hard. Living in a broken world is hard. It doesn't matter if you're the principal of a school or the pastor of a church. You're going to deal with mess and junk. And you're going to have to ask the question, as a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, am I going to be a principal of a school or the pastor of a church in a way that's faithful for the long haul? And there's just been times I've wanted to quit. I wanted to quit when I was in my early 20s, and the youth pastor that I had been mentored by and was serving on staff with fell into a moral failure of sexual immorality in his life, and I became the person who learned of it and had to expose it to the church. God, what have you asked me to do? What have you called me to do? When I got terminated because finances were such that we just can't afford to have you here anymore, God, like, maybe I want to go do something else. You know, like I've got 6 other mouths to feed, and here I am wondering where the next paycheck's going to come from. I went to Matthews, North Carolina to serve prior to coming here. That's where we were last. And I stepped into a church situation in which, as I came in, the search team was like, we're just in a healthy place. You know, our 2 pastors ago, he left, and it was not good circumstances. He needed to go, much like what Jim just described. But we're in a good place. And my first week there, I got a call on Thursday of my first week in the office from the chair of the personnel team that said, I just want to check on you, see how you're doing. I said, I'm doing great. Appreciate it. Thank you. Glad to be here. She's like, well, I really hate to do this to you. Me too. And I don't even know what you're about to do to me. And she said, but we've had a staff situation that's come up, and we need some wisdom to know how to deal with it. And that began what I would say was a brutal time of a solid 2 years of asking the question every week, what is the new big black door that I'm going to open this week? And what gorilla is going to be standing on the other side of it that grabs me by the throat and swings me around, feels like it's going to kill me? So I just want you to know that today's leadership luncheon is not what it normally is. It's not the guy that's come in that's got it all together, who's able to tell you, I have perfectly done this. Now let me give you the 7 encouragements for how you're to do it too. Today is a fellow brother in the trench who some days needs to look in the mirror and say these same things to himself. So 2 Timothy is where I want to focus some attention with you together. I want to look at a comparison of a couple of men briefly here, and I do then want to end with what I would say would be the practical action steps for faithful over the long haul. I just want to read this one verse as we begin together. It's 2 Timothy chapter 4. It's verse 10. Paul, in writing this last letter to Timothy, says, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me. In 1983, it was the inaugural run of the ultra marathon from Sydney to Melbourne, Australia. 544-mile race was going to occur. The day that the race was to commence, over many days, there was a 61-year-old potato farmer who showed up. He showed up in his coveralls, his work boots, but he left his dentures at home because he said when he ran, they rattled and he didn't want to deal with that. He went to the table and said to the registration staff, "I'm here for the ultramarathon." And they laughed. They thought it was a prank. They were looking for cameras. They were like, what does this not have in common with those? Because all the others were these young, strapping bodies in running attire, and here's a 61-year-old potato farmer with coveralls, work boots, and no teeth. Finally, he convinced the registration staff that he was really there to run. They assigned him, I think, number 64. He pinned it to himself, and a little while later, the race began. They began to run. Well, except for him. You see, Cliff Young didn't really run. He did more of a shuffle, and he was just shuffling. The rest of the runners just took off, ran ahead of him, and they were off. It looked like Cliff was going to be royally embarrassed. So over the next 5 days, 15 hours, and 4 minutes, Cliff ran until he got to the finish line. But when he crossed the finish line, to the astonishment of everyone, 61-year-old potato farmer Cliff Young was the first place finisher. The next closest, who came in second place, was 9 hours and 56 minutes behind him. It wasn't his running style. It wasn't his attire. It wasn't even his training that he had done for this ultramarathon. You see, when he started the race, he just ran. Many of the runners had calculated, well, you're going to have to run this amount of time every day, and then you're going to have to sleep for these amount of hours, and you're going to have to do that over successive days. And Cliff never stopped. He ran continuously from the time the race started until he crossed the line. He said, I just pictured myself when I've been out there with my sheep and a lightning storm was coming. And I just pictured myself out there running, rounding up my sheep. I just kept running. He finished first not because of his impeccable athletic body or his gear or his training or his mannerisms of running, his mechanics. It was just faithfulness. He was just faithful. And God calls us to faithfulness. Really, whether or not you're going to be in vocational Christian ministry or not, God calls you to faithfulness. He says in his word, it's required of a steward to be found faithful. Jesus said in Matthew 25:23 that when we cross the line, the finish line, from this life into eternity, that as a follower of Jesus Christ, we're looking for one word of commendation. Well done, good and faithful servant. Pastors don't get a better word of commendation. We're just going to get well done, good and faithful servant. But a faithful follower of Jesus who has been a stay-at-home mom, homemaker, maybe she did homeschooling with her children, but she followed Jesus faithfully in her God-given calling and responsibility, will still be told, well done, good and faithful servant. For when God measures our success, he's going to measure it in faithfulness. Not in books that I've written, conferences that I've attended. It's not going to be measured in whether or not you like me or I'm popular with guys in the Golden Triangle Baptist Network. I want to have friends here. I want to be liked. But God's going to measure it in faithfulness. When God measures success, he measures it in faithfulness. And when Paul's writing this letter to Timothy, you know, he's at the end. It's probably his second time in Roman imprisonment. The first time he got to be in a house with visitors coming and going. It was more pleasant. But this time he's likely been rearrested and he's in a dark, damp, dungeonness, if that's a word, jail cell, prison cell. It's probably in the ground underneath the pavement with just this small opening in the ceiling with a rusty metal grate over it. And here he is knowing at any moment, I'm coming to the end. Previously in his imprisonment, he believed he was going to get out. Now he's like, I'm pretty certain I'm not ever getting out. The persecution under Nero has really ramped up. And so there's an urgency about him. Because Paul says, I'm finishing the race, but there are those who are still going to be running the race. And he thought about Timothy, because he knew that he was about to be handing off the baton fully to a young man like Timothy, and he was concerned that he would be faithful in the discharge of his duties. And so you read that in the sense of the letter. The whole of 2 Timothy, Paul is saying to Timothy, and he says, God's called you to himself. God's called you to ministry. God's gifted you by his grace. Now you need to be a good soldier. Don't get entangled in the civilian affairs. Be faithful to fight the good fight. Pursue that which is righteous. Be a good vessel of honor for the master. He warns him about the dangers, and he encourages him about the faithfulness. And in the midst of that, there's this contrast that emerges. I don't think Paul necessarily so much intended to contrast himself with Demas, but I think it's striking. We start with Demas because what we recognize here is that there was a time of faithful action in Demas's life. Paul says, for Demas has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Well, the only way he could desert Paul in the work was that he once was part of the work. So what was he a part of? Well, in other places like Philemon, verses 23 and 24, or Colossians 4:14, Paul speaks and mentions Demas and says he's a fellow faithful worker. But now Paul says to Timothy, he's deserted me. There's nothing that suggests that Demas became a heretic, by the way. There are some traditions that say that he did, that he renounced the faith, that he completely abandoned Christ. Maybe that was true, but we don't know. And Paul, who has already spoken about Hymenaeus and Philetus and said they have swerved from the truth, I think that if there had been some of that deviation from the truth of the gospel and the hope of Jesus Christ, Paul probably would have mentioned it. So this faithful fellow worker has abandoned the work and abandoned Paul. There was a time of faithful action. He was on mission. He was in the prayer meetings. He was teaching the small groups. He was planting churches alongside of Paul. He was doing the work faithfully. But then there came a moment in which he deserted that work and walked away. There was a time of faithful action, and then there was a tragic love affair that developed. And interesting again that Paul simply says, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. What was he in love with? All Paul says is this present world. Well, was he in love with another woman? Well, Paul doesn't say it was a woman. He says it was this present world. Was it sexual immorality? Paul doesn't say it's just this present world. Was it the pleasures of the world as opposed to the cost of being a follower of Jesus Christ? Paul doesn't say. And these are one of the moments where we could probably infer a lot of things, but probably for our benefit, it's best that it is left in the ambiguous. Because, friends, what might take you out of faithful following over the long haul may not be what would take out another brother or sister in the room. You might be taken out because you have a tragic love affair with somebody who is not your wife, and you commit adultery. Somebody else in the room having a tragic love affair with money might choose the path of embezzlement that takes them out. I pilfered and I stole from the people of God because I had this tragic love affair in my heart to have things that God had not given and entrusted to me. Your tragic love affair may be that you demand your own way, that things have to always be your way. And when it's not, you are angry, and you are not just upset or frustrated, you are angry, and you get violently angry. And that comes out, and it takes you out of the race of not being a Christian, but being a Christian vocational leader. Paul doesn't say specifically what it is, but as George Knight says, the wording of the Greek here with this particular participle could be rendered this way, that Demas has begun to love and still loves the present age. Donald Guthrie says that there's not any suggestion that he became an apostate, as later sometimes is indicated, but rather he became worldly. His heart became entwined, ensnared with the love of this world and its pleasures and its comforts. Frederick Robertson many years ago wrote that worldliness is the attractive power of something present in opposition to something to come. So John Stott says that Bishop Moule may have it right that what Demas really experienced here was he became smitten with cowardice in the reign of terror. He wasn't oblivious that the storm clouds were growing, that Rome was being under the authority of leaders that were growing in their opposition to the gospel of Jesus Christ and those who are named by Christ's name. And as these storm clouds grew, Demas just was like, I'm not sure I want to do this. I don't know if I want to pay this price. This is really hard some days. I mean, we don't always know where the supply is coming from. And while God may have always supplied, I just think if I could have a little more security in my life, if I could have a little more peace in my life, if I could have my weekends back, if I could take my family on a trip on Saturday and Sunday. So some have suggested that it was a fearful heart toward imprisonment and persecution of dying because he saw Paul imprisoned. And he knew that Paul was saying, my days are short. And Paul was not watering down the truth for anyone. He says in the book of Acts, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. I believe that Demas heard those very words. Demas, what's happening to me is going to happen to you. You're not going to get to the kingdom of God seeing it with your own eyes without suffering persecution. But here comes this picture of contrast. You don't get this sense that Paul is trying to say, well, there's Demas and then there's me. But think about the nature of the letter. Here's a man who's at the end, and the contrast could not be more striking. Demas has deserted me and the work of the gospel here because he wanted comfort and pleasure and ease and a life that he had carved out for himself. But I'm near the end. In verses 7 and 8 of that same chapter, just before what he writes here, he says in verse 6, for I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not to me only, but also all those who have loved his appearing. Paul says, I know I'm near the end. I don't have months ahead of me. I have only days. But I fought. I ran. I kept. I fought the good fight. I ran the course. I kept the faith. You know that this theme of running is there in the scriptures. The writer of the Hebrews, run with endurance the race that is set before us. Be faithful in running. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Paul says, I've done that. Was he perfect? No. I think Paul even here gives us an indication that when he refused to take John Mark on the second missionary journey, he probably got it wrong. He thought he was making the right decision because John Mark had been a bit of a sissy and couldn't handle it. And Paul was like with Barnabas. He even broke a friendship over this matter. But when he says here, just after this, and get John Mark and bring him, I think that's a bit of a admission. I think I got it wrong. Maybe they had further conversations about it. He wasn't a perfect man by any means, but he ran the race with endurance and faithfulness over the long haul. In his letter to the Corinthians, he writes about how he has suffered far more imprisonments with countless beatings, often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a day and a night in the sea. On frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. You get the sense? Paul's like, there's not a place I could go that I wasn't in danger. City or wilderness, Jews or Gentiles, robbers, thieves, false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. But he's a true picture of faithfulness. I have fought the good fight. I have kept the course. And I've kept the faith in the midst of it all. John Stott says that as Paul is writing this letter to Timothy, he's looking across his own career of gospel work. For 30 years, Stott says, for 30 years or so, he had faithfully preached the good news, planted churches, defended the truth, and consolidated the work. When God plucked him from the road to Damascus and changed his life by the gospel of Jesus Christ, when the life-changing encounter with the resurrected Christ occurred, Paul was forever changed. And he began to run the race. And he messed up at times. He even would say to the Romans, man, the things I want to do, I just sometimes fail to do them. And the things I don't want to do, I seem to be over and over doing. And who's going to deliver me from this body of death? I have a new spirit. I'm a new man. But boy, I'm trapped in this body of indwelling sin that wars against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh. He wasn't perfect, but he was faithful. He ran with endurance the race that was set before him. Now, if you've still got your copy of God's Word there, I want to ask you to look in chapter 2 of Paul's letter, and I want you to look at verse 22 with me. If we're going to run with endurance and run with faithfulness over the long haul, Paul says something about running right here. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. I want to give these practical action steps in the words of running. I want us to run to something, from something, after something, and with something. But I want to begin, and it's not inherent here, but it's really in verse 5 of chapter 1 when Paul says, I am reminded of your sincere faith. Timothy has run to new life in Jesus Christ. Paul would say to Timothy elsewhere, Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, and I'm the chief among them. Here he says, Timothy, I know that your mother and grandmother had faith in Jesus Christ, and now I am certain that you have that sincere faith. You have been changed from the inside out because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You have run to new life in Jesus Christ. Friends, if we're going to run well with endurance, a life of faithfulness over the long haul, life can't be lived faithfully apart from living in new relationship with Jesus Christ. I'm ever more concerned as I talk with church members and sometimes even pastors that what they're counting on for their salvation is something other than the fact that they turned from their sin, they trusted in Jesus Christ, believing that he died and rose again, and they confess him as Lord. But Timothy had run to new life in Jesus Christ. He had put his faith and trust in Jesus alone for salvation. If we're going to run faithfully, we have to run to Jesus for new life. And brothers, I would be remiss if I just didn't at least pause a moment to say, be sure that your faith is sincere, that you indeed have trusted in Jesus Christ alone for salvation. Some of the most disturbing words to me are Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7. Jesus has just preached a killer message. Not that he could preach anything else but a killer message, but he preached the longest recorded message we have, called the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7. And now he's coming to the invitation time. Yes, Jesus had an invitation. He actually told a story for the invitation. You've heard these words of mine. Now what are you going to do? I'm calling you to respond. Will you be like the man who builds his house upon the rock, or the man who builds his house upon the sand? Because your life is going to be a construction project, and you're going to choose which way you build. But if you build poorly, there's going to be great destruction, not necessarily in this world, but in the judgment. Because the same judgment of God is coming upon all. And if you're built upon the sand, it will fall flat, even if your life looked like it was built very similar to someone who was building upon Jesus Christ. But in there, in Matthew 7, he says to them, and not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. There are false professions all around us. People saying Jesus is Lord, but he's not really Lord. Because they're not trusting in his work, they're trusting in their work. Well, Lord, we preached. We prophesied. We cast out demons. We did good work. We raised money. We helped the hurricane victims. I mean, we were supporting the pregnancy center. And surely we're part of the kingdom. But I never knew you. Depart from me, you who work iniquity. Run to Jesus for salvation. You will only run faithfully over the long haul by having relationship with Jesus Christ. Number 2, run from sin that will ensnare you. In verse 22, he says, flee youthful passions. The word flee means to run as to not be apprehended, which means you are to be a fugitive, not from justice, but from sin. Sin is running after you. God says to Cain in the very earliest pages of the scriptures, hey, if you seek to do well, good. But just know this, sin is crouching at the door. The enemy walks around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. You've got to run. Run away from the things that want to ensnare you, that want to engulf your heart, that want to deceive your mind, that want to lead you to indulge your passions, your pleasures. Run so as not to be apprehended by them. For 3 years, a young boy by the name of Joram Friedman ran for his life. The Nazi Germans came into his Polish town when he was 5. At age 8, he and his family found themselves in one of the Warsaw concentration camps. He began to observe that if he stayed there, death was going to be sure, whether by disease, torture, or some other means, maybe just starvation. So he ran away, and he stayed on the run. An 8-year-old boy running through the woods seeking to evade capture, but he was a Jew. He tried to make sure that people wouldn't find out who he was, but one doctor refused to treat him for when he had broken his arm. They stripped him down naked. They recognized that he was a Jew, and the doctor said, "I will not treat him." And he lost his arm because he didn't get the medical treatment that he should have. He at night would take himself, he would climb up in a tree, he would tie himself to a branch so he wouldn't fall out, just so that he could evade being captured and taken back. That's an 8-year-old boy. We're grown men and women. We should seek to run from sin with the same amount of furor. We need to run to new life in Jesus Christ. We need to run from sin. Don't blush at sin. Know where your weaknesses are and guard yourself. And observe where you think that you're really strong and doubly guard yourself. And run after righteousness, faith, love, and peace. It's not just enough to avoid sin, but we need to be pursuing some things. He says, flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. Every day we've got to be running after the things that bring pleasure to the Father. We're running for the glory of the one who called us into the race and set the path before us. Very quickly, righteousness, right living, making the right decisions, making the God-honoring decisions. In any moment, what is the good, right, and pleasing thing to God? Faith. Trusting God. That's not saving faith, that's sustaining faith. That God, as I run and I don't know what you're doing and things are really difficult and hard, or whatever the case might be, I'm going to be faithful because I'm going to be full of faith. I'm going to trust you. But even more, friends, sometimes we think that it's only in the times of hardship that we might not run faithfully. Your successes can cause you to run in an unfaithful way. Ministry becomes about you and me. Our platform is bigger. Our crowds are larger. The budgets have increased. The buildings are going up. The invitations to speak are all around. The book deals are accumulating. And so it all goes to our head, and this is all about us. And we will cease to run faithfully because our faith now is in us and not in the one who calls us. He says love and peace. They all go together, but for sure, love. That our love, we would run after love of God and love of others more and more. And that there would be peace. Pursue peace. Pursue peace. Psalm 120, I believe, says, I have lived far too long among those who hate peace. Sometimes you would almost want to preach that in your church. I think some of you all just love living in the place of those who hate peace. But you should be one who seeks peace with God and one another. Seek to be at peace with all men as much as depends upon you. And here's a final note. He says, run to new life in Jesus Christ. Run from sin. Run after righteousness, faith, love, and peace. But you don't do these things alone. You weren't meant to be a solo runner. But you're to do this along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Make sure that your traveling companions will aid you in getting to where you're going. You should be running from sin and after righteousness, faith, love, and peace with companions who are not only going to encourage you in that direction, but hold you accountable to that direction. They should be those who are calling on the Lord from a pure heart. Yes, we need to be among unbelievers. Yes, we need to be sharing the gospel with those that are far from Christ. But we need around us people who will hold us accountable. And when they watch us leaving the course, shrinking back, giving ourselves a little extra measure to slide, they hold us accountable. Because we want to be faithful over the long haul. Practical steps, relationship with Christ, fight against sin, pursue the things that please God, and surround yourself with those who are going to help you to get to the finish line. Well, Paul did that. You could take those very things. He's just talking about his life. He came to faith in Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. He ran from sin, even though sometimes he found himself caught up in it. But he pursued after righteousness, faith, love, and peace. And he had traveling companions with him. He had Luke. He had Timothy. He had Titus. He had Epaphras. One time he had Demas. They were helping him to stay faithful and accountable to the task. Gary Hoy worked at a law firm in Toronto. It was the Toronto Dominion Bank building, and they were on the 24th floor. And Gary seemed to really enjoy when the new recruits came in. He wanted to impress them, apparently. So Gary would sometimes say, "Hey, y'all watch this," which is always the way that it ends poorly, right? "Hey, y'all watch this." And Gary would start on one end of the hallway and he'd say, "I'm going to show you that those windows down there have such a good, strong tensile strength that, man, they will hold up my 150-pound frame as I throw myself against that glass." And Gary would run, sprinting down that hallway toward that glass, throw himself into it and bounce right off. One particular day, Gary says, "Hey, y'all, watch this." And he takes off sprinting down through there. And as he does, he runs, he lunges, he hits that glass, but this time that glass popped right out of the frame. And Gary Hoy fell 24 stories to his death out that window. Well, that's a picture of how some have ended their race in a big, tragic, cataclysmic downfall. I could name the names, right? I could name the names. Last week, there was a new name to the list. But I won't do that. You don't need me to do that. I don't want my name on that list. May your name not be on that list. May we be faithful for the long haul.